A few days ago, I came across a strange question while reading about early Ottoman expansion into Europe. How did Croatia beat the Ottomans for the very first time? It sounds like an easy question. Better tactics, better commanders, or maybe a rare Ottoman mistake. But the more you look at it, the stranger it becomes. Because the real explanation has nothing to do with that first Ottoman army, or with anything that happened on the battlefield that day. It begins much earlier, under completely different circumstances, with an enemy that forced this region to relearn what survival actually meant. In the spring of 1241, the Kingdom of Hungary-Croatia was one of the most powerful realms in Europe. It controlled vast lands, could summon tens of thousands of troops, and sat at the crossroads of Central Europe, but militarily, it was completely unprepared for the kind of war the Mongols brought with them. The invasion force, led by Batu Khan and the legendary general Subutai, was not just an army, it was a system. Mongol units could scout hundreds of miles ahead, coordinate movements across entire regions, and concentrate forces faster than European commanders could even exchange messages. These were concepts most Western rulers had never had to deal with. Hungary's first real failure didn't happen on an open battlefield. It happened in the king's head. King Bela IV believed that geography alone could save him. His plan was passive defense: block the Carpathian mountain passes with felled trees, barricades, and local garrisons, and force the invaders to exhaust themselves trying to break through. On the 12th of March in 1241, Mongol forces pushed through the Veriki Pass. They scouted the defenses, found weak points, bypassed obstacles, and smashed the local garrison. The pass fell in a single blow, and suddenly, the Hungarian heartland lay open. The Battle of Mohi, also called the Battle of the Sajo River, fought on the 11th of April in 1241, is probably the clearest snapshot we have of just how rigid, and frankly outdated, the European knightly system had become by the mid-13th century. On one side was the Hungary-Croatia army, built around heavy knightly cavalry and a large body of poorly organized peasant militia. Estimates vary, but most modern historians put the Hungarian force somewhere between 60,000 and 80,000 men. That sounds enormous, and by medieval European standards, it was. King Bela IV believed sheer numbers, armor, and social prestige would carry the day. So the army chose a defensive setup known as a Wagenburg, a wagon fortress. Hundreds of carts were chained together into a rough enclosure, creating a mobile fort where infantry and knights could shelter. This tactic had worked against other European enemies. The assumption was to force the enemy to attack a fortified camp, absorb the shock, then countercharge with armored cavalry. But that assumption rested on one dangerous belief, that the enemy would fight by the same rules. Across the river, Batu Khan and Subutai were preparing something very different. The Mongol army was smaller, probably 30,000 to 40,000 troops, but every part of it was designed for coordination and movement. Their core units were light horse archers, supported by heavier cavalry armed with lances. Every soldier knew his role. Orders moved through flag signals and messengers, allowing coordinated actions even in darkness or chaos. And that's where the imbalance really shows. Hungarian command was fragmented. Bela IV distrusted his nobles. The nobles resented royal authority. Decisions were delayed, debated, or ignored. At Mohi, that internal tension translated into paralysis. When the situation changed, as it inevitably did, the army simply couldn't adapt fast enough. The Mongols, by contrast, had already studied the terrain in detail. Their scouts had mapped river crossings, road networks, and the layout of the Hungarian camp. In the early hours of the 11th of April, Mongol forces crossed the Sajo River at multiple points. One bridge assault drew Hungarian attention, while other units slipped around the flanks. Siege engines, portable and pre-assembled, were brought forward. These were efficient machines capable of throwing stones and incendiary projectiles directly into the packed wagon camp. Fire broke out. Panic followed. Inside the Wagenburg, there was nowhere to maneuver, nowhere to regroup. Command signals were lost in smoke and darkness. And then the Mongols suddenly opened a gap. It looked like an escape route, a safe corridor out of the camp. Under pressure, terrified soldiers rushed toward it. Waiting outside the gap were Mongol horse archers, already deployed in a wide arc. As Hungarian troops poured out, they were cut down in waves. Those who ran were hunted. Those who slowed were surrounded. What looked like mercy was actually the killing ground. By sunrise, the Hungarian army had effectively ceased to exist. Contemporary and later sources suggest that a majority of the Hungarian field army was killed or scattered. Bishops, in barons, experienced commanders, gone in a matter of hours. King Bela IV escaped, but barely, beginning a desperate flight westward. And Mohi was only the beginning. Over the next year, Mongol forces occupied and devastated large parts of Hungary-Croatia. Modern demographic studies estimate that between 15 and 25% of the kingdom's population died from violence, starvation, or disease. In some regions, the loss may have been even higher. The social impact was catastrophic. The administrative elite, the people who governed, collected taxes, organized defense, was nearly wiped out. The destruction of an entire social structure. Some environmental historians claim that depopulation caused by the Mongol invasions removed around 700 million tons of carbon from the atmosphere, as forests regrew on land once farmed by people who were no longer there. After the catastrophe at Mohi, King Bela IV ran across his own collapsing kingdom, with Mongol forces right behind him. As Bela fled south through Croatia toward the Adriatic Sea, he was pursued by the Mongol general Kağan. Contemporary accounts describe Mongol units moving fast, splitting up, burning settlements, and cutting off escape routes. At times, Bela was only days, maybe hours, ahead of capture. As the king moved through the lowlands and river valleys, the pattern was painfully consistent. Earthen forts and wooden castles fell almost immediately. These structures, often built on flat ground, had worked well against local rebellions or small-scale wars. Against the Mongols, they were useless. Mongol siege crews, using compact stone throwers and incendiaries, could batter or burn these forts in a matter of hours, and even when walls held briefly. The surrounding countryside was stripped bare. Supply lines vanished. Garrison troops were isolated and wiped out, or forced to flee. Every mile Bela crossed reinforced the same grim conclusion on open terrain. With weak fortifications, the kingdom had no depth, no second line of defense. Once the field army died at Mohi, the plains were simply open space. But when Bela reached the Dalmatian coastal region, the Mongol advance faltered and then stopped. Cities like Klis split, and Trogir weren't rich in knights or large armies. What they had instead were thick stone walls, elevated positions, and natural barriers that worked with the fortifications. Klis Fortress, for example, sits high on a narrow mountain pass, controlling movement between the interior and the coast. Attackers couldn't simply surround it or rush the walls. Mongol Ziga engines, so effective against wood and earth, did almost nothing here. Stone walls absorbed impacts. Steep slopes limited where machines could even be placed. Attacks stalled. Casualties mounted. For once, the Mongols were the ones burning time and resources. And then Bela took refuge somewhere even more problematic for a steppe army. The king eventually reached Trau, modern Trogir, an island city connected to the mainland by narrow causeways. For the Mongols, this was a nightmare scenario. Mongol cavalry, arguably the finest mounted force on earth, was almost useless in muddy coastal shallows and against fortified island positions. Horses bogged down, supply lines stretched thin, fast encirclement. The Mongols' trademark tactic simply wasn't possible. For the first time since the invasion began, Mongol commanders faced terrain they couldn't solve quickly. This contrast was impossible to ignore. What Bela IV witnessed during his flight was a revelation born of desperation. The kingdom didn't fail because it lacked brave knights. It didn't fail because it lacked men. At Mohi, Hungary had tens of thousands of troops. What it lacked was the right kind of defense. Just as Bela began to fully grasp that lesson, things fell apart. In 1242, the Mongol armies suddenly withdrew. The reason had nothing to do with Hungarian resistance. By Mongol law, leading princes and commanders had to return east to participate in the succession. Bela IV knew this kind of luck might never come again in his lifetime. So, when the Mongols withdrew, he acted immediately, launching one of the most ambitious reconstruction programs in medieval Europe, an effort that Hungarian history would later remember him as the second founder of the kingdom. Instead of relying on one royal field army, Bela pushed for a decentralized network of strongholds. He abandoned one of the oldest royal privileges in the kingdom, the rule that only the king had the right to build and own castles. Bela understood the math now. One army could be destroyed in a night, but 100 fortresses, spread across hills, valleys, and river crossings couldn't be erased all at once. So, instead of concentrating strength in one place, he began to scatter it across the landscape. Bela actively encouraged nobles, bishops, and monastic orders to build stone fortresses by granting them land, tax exemptions, and economic privileges. If a magnate built a defensible castle in a strategic location, the crown didn't see it as a threat anymore. It saw it as an asset. By the end of Bela IV's reign, the kingdom had seen the construction of nearly 100 new fortresses, 66 of them built entirely of stone. To put that in perspective, on the eve of the Mongol invasion, the entire kingdom possessed around 10 stone castles. That's a tenfold transformation in a single generation. These were designed with very specific threats in mind. High stone walls resisted fire and siege engines. Elevated positions denied cavalry any real role. Narrow approaches forced attackers into predictable kill zones. Many castles also included storehouses for grain and livestock, allowing them to shelter not just soldiers, but entire local populations during raids. In regions like Slavonia and Croatia, the rise of stone castles also reflected the growing power of the nobility and the spread of feudal relations. A stone castle was expensive. It required skilled labor, long-term investment, and political backing. Owning one was a statement, like Medvedgrad, one that guarded key approaches near Zagreb. Socially, it was a clear symbol of elite authority, a physical marker that a new class of landholding nobles had arrived and intended to stay. So yes, these castles were defensive, but they also reshaped the balance of power inside the kingdom. Instead of trying to stop invasions head-on, Bela's system created what modern historians call zones of control. A raiding force could no longer move freely through the countryside. Every few days, it encountered another fortified position, another threat to its supply lines, another refuge for civilians, another signal fire that spread warnings outward. This was especially effective against small, fast-moving raiding groups, the kind favored by steppe armies and, centuries later, by Ottoman akıncı raiders. The lesson learned from the Mongols would prove priceless in the future. Bela didn't stop with castles. Another pillar of his strategy was strengthening urban self-defense. In 1242, he issued a golden bull to the citizens of Gradec, modern Zagreb. In exchange for economic privileges and a degree of self-government, the city was required to surround itself with stone walls. This was a crucial shift. Cities were no longer just economic centers waiting for royal armies to save them. They became independent defensive nodes, capable of holding out even if the central government collapsed, as it had in 1241. Multiply that model across dozens of towns, and you get something new. A kingdom where defense responsibility is shared, layered, and resilient. If one city falls, others still stand. If the king is forced to flee, the system keeps functioning. In other words, Bela IV didn't just rebuild walls. He rebuilt the logic of survival itself, and that logic mattered centuries later. Because Croatia's next great enemy, the Ottoman Empire, fought in a way that looked unsettlingly familiar. Long before the main force arrived, they sent in the akıncı, light, irregular cavalry units that lived off raiding the frontier. These men's reward was loot, livestock, captives, and whatever they could carry. In practical terms, akıncı warfare closely mirrored Mongol light cavalry tactics. These units moved fast, often in small groups, and struck deep behind enemy lines. Their goal was to break the economy and the morale of the frontier before the real war even began. This style of fighting, known in Central Europe as Kleinkrieg, or small war, meant constant pressure. Even when no major battle occurred, the damage accumulated year after year. A single raid might capture hundreds of civilians and thousands of animals. Multiply that by dozens of raids each season, and entire regions could be emptied without a single formal siege. That was exactly how the Mongols had softened Hungary-Croatia before Mohi, and the memory of that devastation had never really faded. So when Ottoman akıncı began appearing in the 15th century, Croatia already knew the pattern. The response wasn't to chase light cavalry endlessly across open ground that had failed catastrophically in 1241. Instead, European defenders refined the Mongol-era lessons. Heavy cavalry was still useful, but only in a specific role, breaking up raids, forcing akıncı to scatter rather than annihilating them outright. The real killing power came from something else: ranged fire from fortified positions. This is where one detail really matters. The Mongols themselves had feared the crossbow. Modern experiments show why. A Mongol-style composite bow could fire very rapidly, but a crossbow bolt, especially when shot from a wall, had greater effective range and armor penetration. From a stone tower or castle wall, a crossbowman needed accuracy and power. That's why crossbows became a permanent fixture of Croatian defenses. They were cheap to train with, deadly from elevation, and devastating against lightly armored raiders. What had once been an emergency adaptation became standard doctrine. From 1493 to 1593, the Croatia-Ottoman conflict unfolded as a 100-year war, though not in the way most people imagine wars. There were no clean start and end dates, no single decisive campaign. Instead, it was a continuous series of skirmishes, raids, zieges, and counter-raids, low intensity but relentless. By 1519, the scale of Croatia's role was undeniable. Pope Leo X formally granted the kingdom the title Antemurale Christianitatis, the bulwark of Christendom. This was recognition that Croatia was absorbing blows that might otherwise have reached deeper into Central Europe. The cost was enormous. Some regions were raided so often that population recovery became impossible without outside resettlement. Yet the defensive system held. History almost repeated itself in the most brutal way imaginable in 1493, at the Battle of Krbava field. For anyone who knew the past, the warning signs were there, but they were ignored. The Croatian nobility, led by Emeric Derenčin, made a decision that echoed the worst mistakes of 1241. Instead of using terrain, ambushes, and fortified positions, they chose to meet the Ottoman raiding force in open formation, on flat ground. Several commanders reportedly argued for an ambush strategy, but the noble army pressed forward anyway, confident in tradition, armor, and numbers. The result was devastating. The Croatian noble host was almost completely destroyed. Casualty figures vary, but contemporary sources describe the loss of much of the kingdom's military elite in a single day. Knights, bannermen, and regional leaders wiped out together. The resemblance to Mohi was unmistakable, a rigid battlefield mindset colliding with a more flexible enemy. After Krbava, Croatia's effective territory shrank dramatically. Chroniclers began referring to what remained as reliquiae reliquiarum, the remnants of the remnants. Large swaths of land were depopulated, abandoned, or effectively ungovernable. For a moment, it looked like the end. But unlike the Mongol invasion, the disaster at Krbava did not bring total state collapse. By the late 15th century, Croatia was no longer an open landscape defended by a single field army. The network of stone castles and fortified towns, built and expanded since the 13th and 14th centuries, was already in place. Even when armies were destroyed in the field, the Ottomans couldn't simply occupy the land at will. Ottoman forces could raid around them, but taking them required long, expensive sieges, something raiding armies were not designed to conduct. Just as the Mongols had struggled against Dalmatian stone fortifications in 1242, Ottoman commanders found themselves slowed, pinned, and forced to move on. So while Croatia was badly wounded, it remained anchored. The remnants held because they were physically fortified, and over time, the way Croatia fought began to change again. The first clear sign that the balance was shifting came in 1513, at the Battle of Duba. This time, the Croatian commander was Petar Berislavić, the Ban of Croatia, a bishop who was also a seasoned warrior. Facing an Ottoman force of roughly 7,000 cavalry, Berislavić refused to repeat Krbava's mistakes. Instead, he fought with the landscape. Berislavić coordinated mobile forces along the Sava and Una rivers, using water as a barrier and a weapon. The Ottomans were pushed into narrow corridors, trapped between advancing troops and swollen riverbanks. When retreat came, it turned into disaster. Ottoman commanders were killed. Units broke. Thousands of soldiers drowned while trying to escape. A grim reversal of roles that closely mirrored the Mongol encirclements at Mohi in 1241. Croatia had now learned how to survive and win against steppe-style warfare. These hard-earned lessons were finally locked into place in the 16th century with the creation of the military frontier, or Vojna Krajina. After 1527, the region came under direct Habsburg administration, transformed into a permanent defensive zone. This wasn't a temporary mobilization. It was an institutional commitment. Entire communities were settled, armed, and organized around defense. Soldiers were also farmers. Fortresses doubled as towns. Every river crossing, ridge, and road was watched. In effect, the frontier itself became a standing army. As Ottoman pressure pushed deeper into the Balkans, waves of refugees fled north and west. Serbs, Croats, Vlachs, and Germans crossed into Habsburg-controlled lands, often with little more than their families and livestock. Instead of treating them as a burden, the authorities made a calculated decision. These refugees were offered land, tax exemptions, and, crucially, religious freedom. But in return, they accepted permanent military service. This is how the Grenzers, or frontier soldiers, were born. They were farmers who kept weapons in their homes, knew every forest path and river crossing, and had a deeply personal reason to fight. If an Ottoman raiding party crossed the border, the Grenzers didn't wait for orders from a capital hundreds of miles away. They could mobilize within hours, not weeks. This system directly solved the core failure exposed by the Mongol invasion dependence on a single, centralized army. When that army died at Mohi, the kingdom had been left defenseless. The military frontier made that scenario impossible. Defense was decentralized, layered, and continuous. even if one unit was wiped out. Others were already moving. Akıncı raiders, fast, unpredictable, and terrifying, now found themselves chased, cut off, or forced to retreat almost as soon as they crossed the border. Raids still happened. Damage still occurred. But the scale changed. Instead of entire regions collapsing, losses were localized. The frontier absorbed the shock. By the mid-16th century, the threat facing Croatia wasn't just light cavalry anymore. Ottoman armies now brought heavy artillery, large cannons capable of smashing medieval stone walls that had once seemed indestructible. Tall, narrow castles on hilltops, the kind Bela IV had encouraged after 1242, were suddenly vulnerable. High walls shattered when hit repeatedly. Towers became targets instead of assets. So defenders adapted again. The answer was the Tres Italienne, or Renaissance fortress design. Instead of soaring walls, these forts used low, extremely thick brick ramparts that could absorb cannon fire. Their layouts, often triangular or star-shaped, allowed defenders to cover every approach with overlapping fields of fire. There were no blind spots. Attackers were exposed at every step. The fortress of Sisak, built between 1544 and 1550 by the Bishop of Zagreb, represented the peak of this evolution. Unlike the hilltop strongholds of the 13th century, Sisak sat low, right at the confluence of the Sava and Kupa rivers. At first glance, that might seem risky, but the location was chosen with surgical precision. Rivers acted as natural moats. Movement was restricted. Supply lines could be monitored and cut. This was the heart of the kingdom, what medieval thinkers called medium regni, the central zone whose control determined everything else. Bela IV had understood this centuries earlier when he described the Danube as the river of confrontation. Sisak applied that insight in brick, water, and gunpowder. On the 22nd of June, in 1593, 3 centuries of trial and error finally collided in one place. The man leading that test was Hasan Pasha Predojevic, the Ottoman governor of Bosnia. He arrived at Sisak with what contemporary sources describe as an elite field army of somewhere between 12,000 and 60,000 men. This was meant to be a decisive blow. Inside the fortress, the situation looked almost absurdly uneven. The garrison at Sisak numbered only about 300 to 800 defenders, depending on which record you trust. And in a detail that still surprises people today, they were commanded not by famous generals, but by 2 priests, acting as military leaders out of necessity. On paper, this should have been a massacre, but Sisak was a Renaissance artillery fortress, designed specifically for wars like this one. Its shape mattered. The fort was built as a brick triangle, with round towers at each corner. Those curves weren't decorative. Cannonballs that smashed straight through flat walls tended to glance off rounded surfaces instead. The walls themselves were low but massively thick, more than 30 meters long on each side, and riddled with gun ports. From inside, defenders could fire muskets and small cannons while staying protected. From the outside, attackers found almost nowhere to stand without being exposed from multiple angles at once. And then there was the location. Sisak sat right at the confluence of the Sava and Kupa rivers. Water boxed the fortress in on multiple sides. Any army approaching had to squeeze into narrow corridors of land, limiting how many men could fight at one time. That detail would matter very soon. At first, the Ottomans did what they had done successfully for decades: surround the fort and begin a siege. With their numbers, time should have been on their side. While Hasan Pasha focused on the fortress, a relief army of about 5,000 men was moving fast toward Sisak from the Kingdom of Croatia and Inner Austria. The defenders and the relief army used the rivers like a weapon. The counterattack didn't aim to break the Ottomans head-on. Instead, it pushed them backward toward the Kupa River. What looked like a retreat path suddenly turned into a trap. From the walls of Sisak, arquebusiers, early musket troops, fired en masse, supported by heavier guns, light Ottoman cavalry, effective in open terrain, was devastatingly vulnerable here. The psychological shock, once caused by crossbows in the 13th century, had evolved into something deadlier: coordinated gunfire. Unlike the fractured response during Bela IV's time, this was a unified regional effort. Croats, Slovenes, and Austrians fought together, funded by both the Habsburg monarchy and the Church. At the decisive moment, the garrison didn't stay behind its walls. They sortied out of the fortress, attacking in coordination with the relief force. This wasn't a passive siege anymore. The Ottomans suddenly faced pressure from multiple directions, with a river at their backs. And then the collapse came fast. As Ottoman units were forced toward the river, order disintegrated. Men were pushed into the water. Armor became a liability. Horses panicked. According to multiple accounts, Hassan Pasha himself drowned in the Kupa River, dragged under during the chaos. Contemporary reports describe most of the Ottoman army being killed or scattered, with very few escaping intact. Whatever the exact numbers, the army that had arrived at Sisak essentially ceased to exist as a fighting force, and the consequences rippled outward. The victory at Sisak was so significant that it triggered the Long War, a drawn-out conflict between the Habsburgs and the Ottoman Empire that would last more than a decade. More importantly, it permanently halted Ottoman expansion into Central Europe. For roughly the next 100 years, the frontier stabilized. That's a long pause in imperial history. To this day, the memory of that moment hasn't faded. In Zagreb, a small bell at the cathedral still rings every day at 2 p.m., marking the hour when centuries of adaptation finally paid off.